Hi, and welcome to Identity Crisis. I'm Claire Sufrin, senior editor at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and editor of Sources, a journal of Jewish ideas. I'm stepping in for Yehuda for today's episode. We are recording on Thursday, March 20th, 2025. At the kosher supermarket near my home, there's only one corral for shopping carts in the entire parking lot. And after I load my groceries, there's a moment when I think about leaving my cart right where it is, or perhaps pushing it slightly to the side before getting in my car and driving away. Many other shoppers do just this, which is why, on some days, the parking lot is effectively an obstacle course. Make a good choice, Claire, a tiny voice inside my head tells me. It's a small example. Putting the cart away in the corral is a small action with small consequences. But it's a choice, and that's the point. When I make the small contribution of putting my cart away, I do my part to keep others safe and to make everyone's day a little easier. I opt into the common agreement that these are good things. Philosophers tell us that the study of ethics is about defining the good life, and the practice of ethics is about choosing it. I would forgive an alien anthropologist for thinking, based on so much of the media that surround us, that we 21st century human beings believe the good life is one of pleasure and ease, spent mainly on the beach with a beer in hand. But in ethical terms, a good life is a life defined by good in the sense of good versus evil. Make good choices, we tell our kids as we send them out into the world. When they are young, good choices entail sharing their toys, or when they're older, it becomes returning the shopping cart to the corral. But ultimately, making good choices captures the essence of being ethical, regardless of a person's situation and regardless of how difficult those choices might actually be. I once asked a class of undergraduates how they learned to be moral. I just am, one of them told me. It's natural. I don't think that being moral, that choosing to live an ethical life is natural or inherent to being human. But what this student's comment suggests to me is that we tend to trust that good choices will be discernible in daily life by our own common sense, and in more difficult moments by an institutional ethics committee at a hospital, perhaps, or in a government agency, or according to some code or process set up in advance. Often that's how it works. But other times, especially at times of crisis, ethical choices are anything but obvious. Communities can be ripped apart by debate about what the good is. Sometimes choosing the good involves great risk or causes harm, even though it is the good. War is among the most extreme of these situations. In war, the good is sometimes apparent, but rarely absolute, and the stakes are as high as they can be. Matters of life and death. Over the last nearly 18 months of the Israel-Hamas war, questions of ethics, of what is ethical, have torn Jewish communities apart, particularly in North America, and torn rifts between Jews and their non-Jewish allies. The situation in Gaza right now is about as far from my local parking lot as I can imagine. Closing our eyes and ears and ignoring the very real ethical challenges raised by the war is not an option. The philosopher Charles Taylor defines the good life in narrative terms. That is, rather than seeing each ethical choice an individual person makes as a standalone decision, he describes making ethical choices as a project of writing the story of oneself. At each moment that we choose between options of relative goodness, our choice reflects where we are at that given moment, but it also propels us forward into the next moment when we will next have to make a choice. To put it another way, in choosing any one good, we are pointing ourselves, orienting ourselves toward more good, which we will realize through our further choices. Altogether, these choices will be the story of our lives, and like any story, we want them to be coherent for the moments to connect. In his book, Sources of the Self, where he articulates this understanding of the good, Taylor writes, "In order to have a sense of who we are, we have to have a notion of how we have become and of where we are going. It's a version, perhaps, of a proverb we find in Pirkei Avot, Mitzvah goreret mitzvah. Fulfilling one commandment leads to the fulfillment of another commandment. Or one good deed leads to another. Plenty of people of all backgrounds find Taylor's articulation of the good life and of being a good person compelling. I've consistently found that when I include it on a source sheet for learning with a Jewish group, it's almost always understood and embraced immediately by nearly everyone in the room. Though Taylor is not Jewish, and he does not draw on Jewish sources, there is something about his idea of becoming who you are by building a narrative that seems to align well with Jewish sensibilities. I wonder whether this has something to do with the centrality of storytelling to Jewish practice. Perhaps that's even what you're thinking as you listen to this. The story of creation, of the Exodus from Egypt, and more appear over and over throughout our liturgy. They are retold and relived at our holiday celebrations. And we also have important medieval and modern mythologies we heard from our parents and tell to our children that also help us all to know who we are. The ethical choices a group faces are different from the ethical choices an individual faces, and a group makes decisions in ways that are different from the ways an individual makes decisions. But even if Taylor's theory doesn't scale up precisely, it can still lead us to think about who we want to be as a people by asking, what is the story we, the Jewish people, want to tell about ourselves? What is the story we want our children to tell about us? Another important dimension of Jewish storytelling is what we can call the how. I'm borrowing here from a piece by historian Elisheva Baumgarten that appears in the spring 2025 issue of Sources, which is on its way to subscriber mailboxes and will be online in the first week of April. Elisheva writes that, quote, "We do more than retell our stories. Each generation adds new emphases, adjusting the tales they tell to the concerns and dilemmas with which they are occupied at a given moment. Nothing is ever completely novel, nor is it ever an exact repetition of the past." Elisheva's observation highlights not only that different generations tell Jewish stories in different ways, but that we tell our stories in order to explore, clarify, and express our values in relationship to whatever new situation we are facing. By clarifying our values, stories of the past help us understand who we want to be and what that means we must do. The entire spring 2025 issue of Sources is devoted to the theme of Jewish ethics in theory and practice. Each author addresses a particular ethical concern and offers a vision of how we might or should respond to it as Jews. 4 of the pieces in the issue are about the Israel-Hamas war, and I've invited my colleague, Donniel Hartman, president of the Shalom Hartman Institute, to join me to discuss the piece he wrote about the ethics of war, which is titled Morality in Times of Fear. Donniel opens his article by reminding us how deeply October 7th shattered the sense of security Jews had been feeling, both in Israel and North America, and how it caused us to question the story we had been telling about ourselves. Fear, he writes, is present in our lives in a way most of us have never experienced before, and it has closed down moral discourse in Israel and among North American Jews. With reference to biblical, Talmudic, and other Jewish texts, Donniel then outlines an approach to a renewed sense of Jewish ethics at this moment. Donniel, welcome.
Thank you, Claire. Nice to be with you.
It's always good to be with you, too. So you open your article by describing the effects October 7th had on Israeli Jews and on North American Jews, and in particular, the way the Hamas attack disrupted each community's sense of safety and security. You have been able to be with both communities and to see those similarities. What do you see as the relationship between safety and security on the one hand and ethics on the other?
The relationship is that it's hard. Claire, it's just hard. It's hard for people to find room in their souls. It's hard for people to figure out not only what story they want to tell themselves, to reference your really beautiful intro, but what story they're in right now. It's not what story I want to tell. What story is being imposed upon me? And it's within this alternate story that the moral dimension and the ability to write our story about ourselves, or even if we take the tailored notion to connect who we are now with who we were yesterday, is very, very difficult. Because yesterday I could talk about ethics. Yesterday I could talk about human rights. Yesterday I could talk about freedom of speech. Yesterday I could talk about moral aspirations, and they were very important to me. But right now, I don't even know if I'm going to be. And I don't know if moral aspirations threatens my ability to be. So we're almost pushed into another story. Maybe I would present it this way. We're living in multiple stories simultaneously right now as Jews. And the moral story, which in our tradition is supposed to be a dominant aspect of the way a Jew walks in the world, being a good person. That's what we teach our kids. What does it mean to be Jewish? It means to be a good person. Now, very often that's denigrated as an assimilationist, simplistic answer. But if you actually think about it, it's a phenomenal answer. What could be a more noble description of what your life should be? That the sum total, have your language and your rituals and your foods and your holidays and do all of them. But at the end, are you a good person? And Jews say this is the essence of what it means to be a Jew. And when we do so, we echo a very ancient Jewish tradition, which says that, what's hateful unto you, do not do unto others. That's the whole Torah. The whole Torah. The rest is just commentary, Knock yourself out. Are you a good person? So we tell that story. And then in the midst of that, we find ourselves being compelled to engage in another story, a story in which we have to encounter evil, whether it's the evil of Hamas or it's the evil of those who celebrate October 7th on October 8th, who accuse Israel of genocide simply by virtue of the fact that we died, accuse us of dying. And Jews in Israel and North America are encountering a core evil that we knew was there, but we didn't see it to the same degree. It didn't threaten us to the same degree. It didn't threaten our children to the same degree. It wasn't as prevalent. Maybe we deluded ourselves, but that delusion was nice. And now, how do we continue this story or even thinking about what it means to be a good person at this time and bring the two stories together? Because it's one thing to aspire to be a good person, whether it's in the parking lot or whether it's in your life when you have a sense of stability and security. And then when you're another story, how do I bring that into a story of survival? It's difficult, and for many people, it's a luxury. It's just, leave me alone. I don't want to combine the two stories. I can't. Maybe I'm going to do one story now, and the other, I'll get back to it, but not now.
There are a few things that are jumping out at me from what you're saying, and one is the importance of having a sense of control, right? Taylor's idea that we're telling this story of being or becoming good people assumes that we feel empowered, we feel empowered to make the good choices, that the risk of making good choices isn't overwhelming for one reason or another. And I love that idea that the struggle right now is one of combining two stories that conflict, that don't seem to work together. The new story makes us question the old story. The old story pushes us to feel paralyzed in some ways as we fight instinct versus instinct with the new story. So in your article, you lay out what you call two preconditions for moral discourse. And the first one, I'm going to admit, was a little surprising to me, because the first moral precondition you describe is you say we have to recognize before we even begin that we will sometimes fail in our aspirations to do what is right and just. So I'm curious to know a little bit more about what you mean by failure in this way, why you think it's so important that we recognize this as a precondition. And then I want to push you a little bit to reflect on how this precondition is working in your own thinking and in your own life.
Okay, let's go slowly, part by part. As I think about your question, Again, let's stay within the framework that you set for this conversation. And let's keep on using Taylor as a model. A person has to choose to engage in the telling of a moral story about their life, of the choices that they're going to make. That the good is about embracing a good life. And now, what are the choices that you're going to make? Now, in the context of this story, you have to choose to actually want to tell a story about yourself in which you struggle with and think about the choices you make as to what constitutes being good and decent. Now, imagine that in that story, there is no room for those moments that you failed. Imagine if, and you say, I don't want that story. I don't want a story that entails what I did wrong. I want a story which is constructed solely from all the episodes in which I made good choices. So choice leads to choice, leads to choice, and we live happily ever after in the Garden of Eden, in the world to come. And I will get the medal of the moral, the good person, and the one with the best story. Now, I can understand that, but that's like a child who, the minute they get a bad mark in a certain subject, don't like that subject anymore. They're devastated by the mark. I can't fail. There's no place for failure. But what happens, Claire, if by definition we fail? What happens if that's inherent to the human story or reality? As we're making choices, we're going to make wrong choices also. Could we recognize them? Could we recognize those wrong choices and learn from them as to the next time? It's not going to be as if we're always progressing. There's going to be a graph where sometimes we're going to go down. There's going to be bad years. There's going to be good years. And here, the biblical tradition shouts at us. It screams, ladies and gentlemen, you're created in the image of God. And I want to tell you, you're failing and going to fail all the time. The Bible says you're created in the image of God. And then what do? Not only do we rebel against God in the Garden of Eden, the first thing we do when we leave the Garden of Eden is Cain kills Abel. Mm-hmm. We kill each other. We fill the world with corruption. Throughout the Bible, it's a little depressing book. It never tries to beautify the Jewish people. Really, how many happy endings do we have? Is there one figure who just makes good choices? There is none. None, not even God is portrayed as making good choices all the time. The story of building a good life and embracing it, of making good choices, is inherently a story of making good choices in the midst of making bad choices. That's the way we do ethics. You would then have to choose. Now, could you handle the fact that you're going to make bad choices? So first, I want to posit that as self-evident. If you're human or even if you're God, you're going to make mistakes. It's inevitable. Now, why is this so critical? Because if you can't handle the fact that you are going to make wrong choices, you're going to exit the moral story. You're not going to want to even engage in that story. I only want to deal with my successes. Mm-hmm. But if I'm failing and I see I'm also failing and people critique me as failing, I could just give up on the exercise. There's two things I could do. I could say, let me enter into some moral relativist universe. I don't want to play because I don't like some of the marks I'm getting. But even more destructively, if you cannot handle the fact that you're going to make wrong choices, you might choose to exit moral life or the moral storytelling, or more problematically, you could then just simply give yourself the marks that you want to have without any correlation to what you deserve. In other words, you could begin to describe everything that you do as morally justified by definition because it is your story. You're the master of your story. So why should I tell a bad story about myself? I'm going to portray it. I'm going to edit. I'm going to cut and paste it. And everything that I do is a good choice. Now, if that's the case, that you could only get a good mark, what you're ultimately doing is ascribing moral value to things that aren't worthy of having that moral value. All criticism of you has to be silenced. All self-reflection is moved aside. It's irrelevant because I know if I do it, It's going to be good. In my story, I'm the master of the story. And so if you do that, if you can't accept that you're going to fail, the moral pursuit is going to be something that you are frightened from, or self-aggrandizement and self-righteousness are going to be your inheritance. But the minute self-righteousness defines who you are planting moral failure in the midst of your existence, in the midst of your story. So I know it seems strange, but moving now to our war and to our reality, could we, as lovers of Israel, as committed Jews, accept that of course we're going to fail, that of course there's going to be things that we do wrong, and I want to know about them. I want to, more than that, the next choice I make is going to be based on learning from this, not ignoring it. Mm-hmm. And so there is no moral story unless you accept the fact that failure is inherent to your journey, and therefore not everything that you're going to do needs to be qualified as morally just. Now, the challenge, not just of Israel, of every national entity, is they want, I want to make Israel or America or Canada or wherever it might be great again. Now, how do I make you great again? One way to make you great again is to assume that there are no failures. Just tell a different story. I'm great. And criticism itself is unpatriotic. But when that's the definition of patriotism and loyalty, then moral corruption becomes whitewashed and camouflaged as wonderful moral choices, which those who criticize you are either anti-Semites or anti-American or anti-Canadian or biased or self-hating or whatever they may be. So do you feel that clarifies the first aspect of your question?
It does clarify it. And what I find myself thinking is that this is sometimes the way the narrative of victimhood works. Correct. Right? Our story is a story of victimhood. As victims, we cannot fail morally. Everything we do is justified, and that blinds a people to their own failures.
Absolutely. Victims, you need to have a sense of strength to recognize and a sense of confidence and being empowered to realize that you also fail. You also need an environment in which your failures don't undermine your right to exist, because then too, it's like if every failure you get kicked out of school, if every report card is the end of your academic life, it's like there's going to be a moment where every test you ever took is going to be counted and calculated. You're finished. It can't be. Now, when victimhood is so essential to your being, you also don't have the space emotionally, politically, to make room for self-criticism. But even more insidious is when victims think that by definition, because of their victimhood, anything they do is justified. That's one of the dangers of anti-Semitism, is that Jewish history of anti-Semitism, culminating in the Holocaust, but then continuing afterwards, have enabled us to feel such a sense of victimhood that, especially in comparison to those around us, anything we do is fine. Who is guilty? The one who has power. I'm the victim here. And when you're the victim, that basically is also what Hamas has done. Hamas and its supporters assume that since there is an occupation that only Israel is responsible for, and since Israel is an apartheid, genocidal, colonial state, that as victims, we can't do any wrong. Now, we have to be very careful after October 7th not to transform the victimhood of October 7th into a definition of self-righteousness, that anything that we do in response to that, because we're the victim at that moment. That's, again, an aspect of shutting down a consciousness that you fail and that your responsibility in your story is not to not fail, but it's to be able to and to be responsible for correcting those failures.
So your second precondition, I think, actually pushes in the other direction, right? It sees a different risk. And your second precondition is that self-defense is a moral duty, So can I invite you to sort of add that into the structure that you're building for us here?
Right. Again, it's not intuitive. Like if you would ask people, what are the foundations of morality? I don't think anybody would mention these two. Now, I know there's always a challenge to be innovative, but sometimes if you're too innovative, you're also wrong. But these two are foundational principles precisely in times of fear and danger and war. Now, in our tradition, self-defense is a core moral responsibility. It's your first moral responsibility. The commitment to all human beings as being created in the image of God and as being endowed with inalienable rights, in particular the right to life, has to start in the Jewish tradition with your commitment to your own life. If you're not committed to your own life, we question your commitment to any life. You love your neighbor as yourself. If you don't love self, you don't love neighbor. That's our tradition is so, it's one of the simplest and clearest principles that there's almost no debate on. Commitment to life starts with your own life. That means self-defense is a moral responsibility. Now, why is self-defense a moral responsibility so critical for moral reflection? First, if self-defense and morality are in conflict with each other, you're not going to engage in moral concerns in times of war. We know this. In times of fear, in the Maslow hierarchy, you're going to be committed first and foremost to survival. And if morality is not part of your survival discourse, then morality is going to be set aside. So in times of war, when you are working on self-defense, if you don't see that as a core part of your moral responsibility, morality is going to be something that endangers you. It's going to be a luxury that you can't afford. And so it's critical after October 7th that we embrace the moral righteousness of self-defense. And by doing so, we enable morality to be part of the story. Going back, there's two stories being told. There's a story of choosing the good, and there's a story of survival. Those two stories in our tradition are one. When you engage in survival, you're engaging in a moral enterprise. And then you could bring the two stories, they could merge. But if you see them as separate, and you don't internalize, or that morality is only sacrifice for the other. Morality is seeing the other. Levinas speaks about how morality begins when you could see the other's face. No, morality begins when you look in the mirror. When you look in the mirror and you see yourself and see your face, that is a critical recognition that we need in times of war. Because otherwise, ethics cannot be brought into the battlefield because they're in conflict. Because anytime I kill, I'm acting immorally. In the Jewish tradition, it's not true. If someone comes to kill you, we are obligated to kill them first. And when you embrace self-defense as a moral enterprise, not only is not a zero-sum game, but even more than that, you now say, okay, I'm allowed to kill in self-defense. But then I'm only allowed to kill in self-defense. So morality both justifies your embracing of self-defense, but morality then requires that you only engage in self-defense. And that means anything that does not involve fighting combatants, anything that does not enhance your security. The moment the war is no longer necessary in order for you to survive, at that moment, there is no conflict between ethics and survival. It's between ethics and rage and cruelty. So here too, this is a critical moment where you have to decide. If you see the pursuit of your own safety as a moral agenda, then you can bring morality into the battlefield. If you don't, then, and in a conflict in times of fear, you're always going to pick your own survival. But there's another dimension to it, but I could hold for a moment.
You could see the look on my face.
I could see the look on your face.
You learn as a teacher, especially, how to recognize when people have words right, on the tips of their tongues. So I want to try out this way of phrasing it, and you'll tell me if I'm getting it right. I think that what you're saying is there's a temptation when we talk about self-defense to sort of say self-defense is a step away from morality. It's just like a base human instinct to take care of your own life. And if that's the mode that you're in, you've shifted out of the mode of morality, you've shifted into some other more basic mode. And
Correct.
You're disagreeing.
Now, Maslow does this. In his hierarchy of needs, he talks about a base need for security and safety, and morality is self-actualization at the top of that pyramid. But in our tradition, the pyramid is squished. So when you are engaging in the pursuit of self, of your own right to live, that's an expression of self-actualization. Moral self-actualization is not only through altruism, it's all through the pursuit of just self-interest.
So I hear you saying, I'm imagining an interlocutor who is defending the war on the basis of self-defense and making a sort of anything goes, therefore, kind of claim. And you saying to this interlocutor, no, self-defense is the opening of the moral discourse. It is within the moral discourse, and we cannot shut down the rest of the conversation. We actually have to engage deeply, more deeply than ever. Is that
right? That's exactly correct. And I see the consequences, because the person who says that is removing moral discourse. And you do so under a false premise that this is your base, not even a right, your base need of survival.
Mm-hmm.
When we shift from need to rights, which is what our tradition does, then we could bring our moral conversation in and then have serious conversations about what is our moral responsibility to Gazans. At what point, if Hamas is stealing humanitarian aid and using it to arm itself, do we still have a moral responsibility? Do we not? All of these are serious questions. When do we bomb? When they're using human shields, when they're not? What is proportional? Morality could enter into the battlefield, but it doesn't enter the battlefield when there are separate agendas. One is a need and one is a moral aspiration. And humans will always respond to their first needs before they deal with their moral aspirations. But there's another side to this story, Claire, if I could add, that
Sure.
I've noticed as having a serious impact on Jews both in Israel and North America. While the right to self-defense could be recognized as a moral need, as a moral right, our Jewish people in Israel's right to self-defense is not viewed as a moral right. And that the only country that doesn't have a right to defend itself is Israel. And you could see it on the October 8th condemners of Israel. October 8th, Israel was already wrong because we died. Already, we were responsible because we created the experience of occupation on the part of Hamas. What else do you want them to do? It's your fault.
Mm-hmm.
Or in Israel, a constant flow in which criticism undermines our right to exist. Now, everybody is going to fail, but Israel's failures delegitimize its basic existence. So the experience of many Jews is that when our right to self-defense is not seen as a moral cause, when we have no moral legitimacy to protect ourselves, for some, Jews look at this and say, this is moral chaos. This is complete, total moral relativism. And in a world of moral chaos, why should I be the moral light? I'm living in a world where evil is celebrated, where October 7th is considered a holiday. Not in the whole world. There are people who could say it unabashedly, publicly. This is a holiday. And teach in an American university or a Canadian, I could say it publicly to Jewish students. This is a holiday when your people were killed. And we're looking and saying, if this is the universe I'm living in, this is a moral Sodom and Gomorrah of a different type. And I don't have to be the moral beacon in this universe. Like a plague on all your houses. If this is what morality has become, this is complete moral corruption. And when there's a prevalence of moral corruption, or an experience of a prevalence of moral corruption, it's very hard to push yourself to say, so Nu, what are your moral standards? It's like you're living in a world where there are no moral standards. And it's very hard to be the alone moral voice in a world of moral depravity. And so that too, it's when our right to defend ourselves is deemed as immoral that for many Jews, let's just shelve moral discourse for now. We're in an alternate universe.
So, Donniel, thank you. A lot of what you are saying is echoing with my experience here as a North American Jew. And I want to close with a question. I want to push you to reflect specifically on the differences that you see in the conversations in Israel and the conversations in North America, because I know that you've traveled countless times between the two communities over the last year and a half, and that you've had a vantage point that few of us have. My sense, I'll go ahead and throw it out, is that the two communities are having very different conversations when it comes to what Jewish ethics means or should mean in the moment. So I guess A, do you agree? Is that correct? And B, what would you do? What would you have us do to bring our conversations together or to be telling the same story? Again, if we want to go back to that metaphor.
The communities are having very, very different conversations, but there are places, especially amongst pro-Israel leaders and Jewish communal leaders, the differences aren't as dramatic, or among some of them. On the basic level, the average Israeli is not telling a story which is founded on the two preconditions that I mentioned anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The average Israeli, for a while now, has shut down all external and internal criticism and self-reflection. And victimhood, and it starts already from the Second Intifada, the fact that they said no. It's just, and especially in relationship to the enemy that we're living with, where there's a statement in Israel, no one's going to teach us ethics. No one. You're not going to teach me ethics. And the environment is not one for self-reflection, any space for asking, what have I done wrong? And so that precondition, when you begin to engage in moral conversation, there's this antagonism because what are you criticizing? Are you criticizing my kids in Gaza? Like there's a shutdown to that. Also, people feel unsafe with the boundaries that morality might place on their ability to win.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand it and I talk about it and they agree with me. You know when someone agrees with you and they say, yes, but. Yes, but. So in Israel, it's very strong. Those two elements aren't as prevalent in North America. But there is one feature where it is. And that is in many of the priorities of the Jewish community. As I travel around and I might talk about issues that Zionism and a love of Israel has to be about a vision of the Israel that you want. Zionism in Israel is about the Jewish people embracing the good and translating that into a total society with mistakes and imperfections. But that's our journey. That's who we are. Some believe that conversation alone exposes them or has a family resemblance to the anti-Semitic criticisms of Israel. And therefore, all criticism there's an extension of the umbrella of anti-Semitism so wide that there's almost no room for that criticism because, it's criticizing Israel disproportionately and all of the above. There's a silence to it. And there is no doubt that the American Jewish community now's primary agenda is to combat anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. That threat and moral aspirations, moral conversation, an attempt to build allyship through moral partnerships as distinct from legislation and power is definitely on the decrease in public American and Canadian discourse. You sense it. People don't have as much room. I want to talk about Israel, the challenges to our souls, speaking about whether the next generation of North American Jews are going to want to have a relationship with an Israel that doesn't engage in certain moral questions. How do we engage in those? Okay, that's fine. But what about anti-Semitism? Or that's fine, and don't we have to defeat Hamas too? So there are differences, but there aren't differences everywhere. Both communities have to find a way to ask, how do we tell the story of our lives, of the choices that we make in the midst of fear? Because the challenge of morality is never the challenge to tell it only in times of prosperity and success. Who you are is tested when your stories aren't easy and when your stories are filled with dilemmas and doubts and suffering. And so our job together is to help the Jewish people reclaim what I believe is the most essential story that we have to tell. And that's the story of how being Jewish engages with, embraces with, aspires to be a story of a good and worthy life.
I hesitate to add anything that was such a fine ending. I'll just say one more thing, which is what I hear you saying, which I'm really going to be, thinking over for the rest of the day and probably beyond that, is saying, especially to Israelis, okay, maybe nobody else can teach you ethics or can teach us ethics, but we have to be sure we're learning it ourselves.
Correct.
Right. Maybe we don't have good teachers out there. We have plenty of good teachers inside. And with North American Jews, I think we're right back at the who are we going to allow to tell our story? And again, an assertion. There are plenty of people out there who would like to tell the Jewish story, and we need to choose to tell it ourselves and tell it in such a way that it's not a story of victimhood or it's not a story of closing down, but a story of opening up and moral engagement. And I really appreciate that. So thank you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Claire. I love being here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our guest host, Claire Sufrin, and our guest, Donniel Hartman. The spring 2025 issue of Sources is on its way to subscriber mailboxes now and will be available online in the first week of April. Identity Crisis is produced by me, Tessa Zitter, and our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was produced with assistance from Annie Beyer-Chaffetz and edited by Gareth Hobbs at Silver Sound NYC, with music provided by So-Called. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas for what we should cover in future episodes, so if you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. See you next time, and thanks for listening.